Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Melissa. And I want to thank our keynote presenters for a tremendous presentation for the gathering of statistics and facts that have really illuminated this question and this problem. And it's been pointed out in the chat that really our keynote speakers presented, it was an empirical overview of statistical correlations between those who identify as Christian nationalists and support it, and other social outlooks. But I suppose we can't pretend that it also wasn't without some level of value judgment. I think it's clear from the presentation that the presenters, and in fact, the conference here and the way it's organized, views Christian nationalism as a problem for both Americans and for Christians. But I thought that really, to begin the discussion, it would be helpful to understand how Adventists in the past and how Adventists presently distinguish between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism. Because I think it can sometimes, discussions of nationalism and Christian nationalism can leave some people confused as to, where is love of country appropriate for a Christian? And we're not, in criticizing Christian nationalism, criticizing all forms of patriotism. And I think it's helpful to look back at our history, at our founding, to see what early Adventists believed about the role of the United States in both prophecy and history. And I've come up with a couple of definitions. This is partially based on Thomas Kidd is a historian at Baylor University, and he has a nice blog that's easily found, Christian Nationalism versus Christian Patriotism. And I've taken some of his ideas and modified them somewhat to suggest these competing definitions, if you will, of Christian nationalism versus Christian patriotism. I think the Christian nationalism we've just had described empirically for us would go something like this, that the Christian nationalist believes that God has ordained the United States to play a special role, not just in history, but probably in salvation history, and that the advancement of the US's prestige and power essentially equals the advancement, if imperfectly, of the kingdom of God on earth. And of course, given its history and cultural and social makeup, that history has its roots in Western European white Christianity. It might be summed up in a phrase like this: my country, right or wrong, deserves my unconditional loyalty, as long as it's advancing the patriotic outlook of my country. Christian patriotism, I'd suggest, is somewhat different, and actually has biblical foundations in both Romans 12 and 13. And it would say something like this: it's not that God doesn't care about America. Indeed, God has blessed the United States. But as he has other nations, insofar as it and they operate according to principles of justice and equity, but that the United States and other nations need to be called to account when they fall short, when America falls short of its aspirations and violates those principles. You might summarize that by saying, my country, thus I must call it to do right and call it out when it does wrong. And I think you'll find this balanced approach to America and patriotism among our Adventist pioneers. I would suggest they were appreciative Christian patriots, but emphatically not Christian nationalists. You can find many expressions of appreciation and support for America's founding documents, especially the Declaration of Independence and its claim of human equality. They also praise the Republican form of government that the Constitution guaranteed and the civil liberties of the Bill of Rights, especially the religious freedoms of the First Amendment, which they associated with the principles of Protestantism. Most of you are familiar with the great book, The Great Controversy by Ellen White. You can read on page 441 a positive description of these principles, an appreciation for the blessings that America gave. Other Adventist leaders and writers, A.T. Jones, Uriah Smith, said similar things. But theirs was not an unalloyed patriotism. This is what stops them from being Christian nationalists. They were very aware of America's shortcomings and not shy about listing them and criticizing the nation. Revelation 13 had a picture of a lamb-like beast that spoke as a dragon. I'm not going to spend much time talking about it because Jeffry Rosario is going to go into depth about the meaning of that. But essentially, those two horns stood for Protestantism or religious freedom, as well as republicanism, a representative form of government that protected the civil liberties of the people. But even as it held up these ideals, our founders believed that it spoke as a dragon, and that speaking was something occurring then. And chief among that speaking as a dragon was the slavery and racism of the day, as well as the amoral exploitative capitalism that countenanced trafficking in humans, as well as other forms of immorality, such as alcohol and prostitution. They also criticized American overseas militarism. Now, there was I want to share a short part of a much longer poem by Uriah Smith. This was in the official church publication in the 1850s about the two-horned beast like a lamb, the two fundamental principles in which on all the earth none can be found more mild, more lamb-like in their outward form and name, a land of freedom, pillared on the broad and open basis of equality, a land reposing neath the gentle sway of civil and religious liberty. Lamb-like in form, is there no dragon voice heard in our land, no notes that harshly grate upon the ear of mercy, love, and truth, and put humanity to shame? Let the united cry of millions tell, millions that groan beneath the oppression's rod, robbed of their rights to brutes degraded, and soul and body bound to others' will. Let their united cries and tears and groans that daily rise and call aloud on heaven for vengeance answer. Let the slave reply, O land of boasted freedom, thou hast given the lie to all thy loud professions, first of justice, liberty, and equal rights, and thou hast set a foul and heinous blot upon the sacred page of liberty. And whilst thou traffickest in souls of men, thou hurlst defiance proud in face of heaven, soon to be answered with avenging doom. Quite a remarkable poem, 1853, several years before the Civil War, at a time when the issue of slavery was probably the most politically contentious and contested issue in the country. And yet its political orientation did not stop Uriah Smith from writing this poem in our official church newspaper, taking a strong stand on what many would consider to be a distinctly partisan issue. But they viewed it as their duty to do that because they thought that the prophetic gospel message of the book of Revelation called for a commentary on these social ills and problems. And it didn't go away after the Civil War went away. A.T. Jones similarly criticized the Spanish-American War on grounds of imperialistic militarism and capitalism, as well as on nationalistic, religious, and racial grounds of that war. The Liberty Magazine is the official publication of the Adventist Church on issues of religious freedom, and it existed back then under the title Sentinel of Christian Liberty. And in the 1902 edition, the Adventist editors wrote an anti-imperialist dissent about the Spanish-American War and published articles that condemned the war in the Philippines as a race war, particularly a war of Anglo-Saxons against a colored race. They were very clear that this Christian nationalism was a European-centric philosophy that upheld whiteness at the expense of other races. And they were vocal in their opposition to racism and xenophobia, imperialism and militarism, as well as the exploitive capitalism that drove this American imperialism. Now, those three topics may be familiar with some of you who are aware of American civil rights history in the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1967 speech on the three evils essentially identified those three very elements that A.T. Jones, Uriah Smith, and Ellen White had called out in turn of the century America. Here's a quote from his speech, talking about the sickness of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism. Not only is this our nation's dilemma, it is the plague of Western civilization. Now, paradoxically and sadly, by 1967, most Adventists, at least white ones, and it's interesting that our keynote presenters have pointed out that it's the white Christian nationalists that are having troubles with this, were convinced that American capitalism and militarism are mainly good things. And while they would have theoretically objected to racism, they would have had said that it should not distract us from preaching the gospel. So what happened in the 50 years between Smith and Jones and White critiquing American racism, militarism, and exploitive capitalism, and the 1960s and 1970s? Well, I have to share very quickly some research that both Kevin Burton and Douglas Morgan, Adventist historians, have written up. Kevin Burton in some unpublished papers that I hope he publishes very soon at this point. But it was shortly after the death of Ellen White in 1915 and the end of the First World War, where Adventists came under suspicion by the government for not being sufficiently patriotic. Burton writes that government leaders were concerned about the Adventist opposition to exploitive capitalism, their sympathy toward labor unions, their non-combatant position toward the war, their apparent lack of patriotism, as well as the critique of Revelation 13 and the two-horned beast, as long with our international constituency and our immigrant-connected and friendly institutions. They reviewed our books and publications, and in a remarkable series of events, found disagreement with several of them, including Carlisle B. Haynes' The Return of Jesus, which the assistant U.S. attorney found to be that the book should be, that it was seditious, and that this book should be stopped, all extant copies should be destroyed, and a full report made as to the intent of the publishers with a view of possible prosecution. Burton records, to avoid prosecution, they ceased further distribution of the book and verified that all the copies left in the publishing houses had been destroyed. But perhaps worse were books not destroyed but revised. Bible Readings for the Home Circle is a very famous Adventist book, but many Adventists don't know it was modified in 1916 at the request of the government, changing some headings, moving the United States out of the picture of prophecy, and putting the role of America, changing it in three ways. Douglas Morgan, Adventist historian, notes. Adventists began to neglect the civil horn of the two-horned beast. No longer would they critique the American government for violating minority rights or basic civil liberties. They would focus exclusively on religious liberty and Sunday law issues. Secondly, before World War I, Adventists had typically ascertained that America was speaking as a dragon at the moment, then, in the way it treated minorities and the way it prosecuted wars. But after World War I, Adventists tended to emphasize that America would only become beastly at some point in the future. And when I grew up in the 1970s, that was my understanding. America would someday speak as a dragon in passing laws to regulate worship. But now it was a friend of liberty and equality. And finally, they internationalized the persecuting power, perhaps setting the stage for seeing the persecution coming from an international organization like the UN, rather than the American political system. It's interesting in concluding to see the development of this through the 20th century. Of course, after World War II, there was another resurgence of patriotism. Pathfinders is a wonderful organization, and I'm not meaning to criticize it here. It has its roots in the early 1900s, but I find it interesting that the more militaristic elements of Pathfinders, the marching, the uniform wearing, the flag waving, didn't begin until the Cold War era of the 1950s. Again, Pathfinders is a wonderful organization, but perhaps we sometime need to reconsider some of the marching flag waving elements, which has really caused or is a symptom of many American Adventists moving from being patriotic Christians or Christian patriots, willing to support but also willing to critique their country, to being Christian nationalists who are willing to embrace almost anything and everything that their patriotic governmental leadership is willing to undertake. The question of Christian nationalism is such that we can no longer ignore it as Adventists. We have to acknowledge and embrace that we can be good Christian patriots, but Christian patriotism has to involve the willingness and the ability to dissent when either the country or its leadership begins violating basic principles of justice, equality, and fairness. Our pioneers will be very surprised to find us doing otherwise these days, and hopefully a study of this history can help get us back on the right track. So thank you for this time, and I'll relinquish my screen and time.
Thank you, Nick, for this overview. And I've been asked to focus on the prophetic element of how these things connect. And that brings me back to an earlier generation. And in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on a slice of history to take us back to that early generation of Adventists. Christian nationalism, the amalgamation of religion with American patriotism, this idea that America is God's chosen nation, is something Americans have long articulated in different ways. But it was particularly in the 19th century, that second generation after the revolution, that this belief was more widely popularized and deeply rooted in the national psyche. Those are the very decades when the Adventist movement emerged, and during that same period, Adventists crystallized their interpretations of prophecy to emphasize the role of the United States in apocalyptic history. Now, it's this timing that I believe helps situate the radicalness of the Adventist view. I'm interested not just merely in their view of America in prophecy, but more importantly, how that view informed the perspective and the actions of early Adventists. There are lessons to be learned from the times when the church has lost the plot, no doubt about that. But it's also helpful to revisit previous generations that demonstrated a level of moral clarity on this issue. In that generation, from the 1850s to the turn of the 20th century, some Protestant churches were among the most influential forces that helped shape public opinion about the nation's religious character. Religious leaders imagined their nation as the beacon of civilization, executing God's plan, fulfilling God's providence. And by fusing God, country, and flag, Americans baptized their nationalistic agenda and their wars as a worthy cause. Now, at the time when patriotic fervor ran high among American Christians of all ranks, Adventists publicized their view that Revelation 13 depicted the US government as the beast masquerading as an innocent lamb while behaving like a vicious dragon. I mean, in terms of timing, we can say that was really bad timing. Now, this image exposed a crucial contradiction. It depicted a nation whose religious culture, whose political culture, would make a profession to Christianity while endorsing policies that undermined Christian principles of justice and liberty. It signaled a corrupt misrepresentation of the religion of Jesus and highlighted the role that mainline Protestantism would play in amalgamating religious and nationalistic ideology. Adventist view on Revelation 13 and American prophecy presents in my view, a fascinating dynamic, because here we have an Adventist teaching that is specifically tailored and fine-tuned to reject the notion that the United States is a Christian nation, to reject the notion of Christian nationalism. It actually claims that that whole idea and myth is theologically and morally bankrupt. Now, technically speaking, of course, any Christian, regardless of affiliation, can apply principles from Scripture to conclude that Christian nationalism is at odds with the basic ethos of the gospel. But in the Adventist prophetic worldview, rank and file members did not need to begin with a general biblical principle and then do the hard work of applying that to the specific contemporary case of the United States. Instead, it was already explicitly in the church's interpretation. It was literally a literal application. Now, I know some might disagree with this, but at least in this sense, of all people, Adventists would be the last to imbibe the myth of a Christian nation, of Christian nationalism, I should say. In the latter half of the 19th century, my sense is that this perspective guarded many of those early Adventists from getting swept in the frenzy of Christian nationalism. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, we can say that from the 1850s to the turn of the 20th century, Christian nationalism, or the myth of a Christian nation, stood on at least three assumptions. One, that the American population was truly Christian. Two, that the government itself in practice reflected Christian ideals. And three, that the United States was God's chosen nation. Now, based on their prophetic view of Revelation 13, Adventists undermined these assumptions. They rejected the claim that most American citizens were actually reflecting Christian ideals. But how could one even measure that? Was it church attendance polls? I mean, how do you even measure that? Was there some other reference point? Now, here they drew attention to the government's policies as an expose of the citizens' hearts. Since Americans claimed that their government was a representative institution by the people, for the people, then Adventists claimed that by analyzing the nation's policies, one could judge the general fabric of society and cross-examine the nation's Christian professions. Because it was the people who selected their representatives in government, and politicians endorsed policies in harmony with their support base. Congress embodies the temper of its time, as one writer put it. Whatever the condition of the nation, Congress reflects that image back to the American people. So from the 1850s to the turn of the 20th century, Adventists marshaled damning evidence of government policies that, according to them, revealed the true character of the nation, which was, as Uriah Smith put it, Uriah Smith, the conservative, as I call him, quote, dark with injustice, marred by oppression, intolerance, and wrong, end quote. The issues discussed in the Adventist press in this period, far too numerous to mention and beyond the scope of my short talk, but included racial oppression, not only slavery, generally speaking, but specific racist government policies like the fugitive slave law, the Dred Scott case, et cetera, and how these tendencies were not merely sectional, because even in the North was complicit. But beyond that, which is more familiar, there was also the military-industrial complex. And into the 1890s, as the United States embarked on an imperial project to extend its military dominance and political power throughout the world. Now, that policy involved an aggressive war campaign, the first case of state-sanctioned torture abroad, economic manipulation, Nick has alluded to, and the forceful subjugation of vulnerable populations. So from the Adventist perspective, Americans had weaponized the Christian nation myth to serve other interests, militaristic, political, etc. In all this, Adventists constantly rehearsed their prophetic interpretation, their view of Revelation's lamb-like dragon beast. One editorial remarked that, quote, "The voice of a dragon is frequently heard issuing from the halls of Congress." The professions of the government were lamb-like, yes, but the nation had a dragon's heart. Lambasting their government's glaring contradictions, they tried to challenge the ideology of Christian nationalism. And one writer concluded with these words, quote, "Professing religion, being declared Christian, and yet proving false to every principle of Christianity, is it not time that the hand of fellowship be withdrawn and the United States taken off the church books?" End quote. And of course, the fact that at the highest levels of government, the nation's policies were inconsistent with Christian principles of justice, equity, and human rights actually suggested something deeper about the American people at large. As one writer declared, "If there is corruption in politics, it is only a reflection of the hearts of the people. In a representative government, this truth is unavoidable." Both at the highest levels of government and at the popular level, the belief in the United States as a Christian nation, according to these Adventists, was utter nonsense. But America was indeed engrossed, but not in Christianity, in a kind of religiously infused, warped patriotism. This is what some sociologists have called American civil religion. Not Christian specifically, but a collection of beliefs and rituals that were institutionalized to form a national religious self-understanding. The founding fathers are the quasi-prophets. The founding documents are the sacred texts. And it all worked together to serve jingoistic ends, to promote visions of American exceptionalism and superiority. The Adventist press repeatedly leveled the charge that Americans were drunk on patriotism, that religious culture was not worship of Christ, it was worship of the nation. And it elevated loyalty to the nation while clouding the higher sensibilities of Christian ethics regarding social and political issues. Like all religions, American civil religion also has its own venerated symbols, and Adventists chimed in on touchy issues like the veneration of the American flag. In 1900, an article titled "On Bended Knee" by C.P. Bowman, was the editor of the Sentinel, stated that there was nothing divine about the flag and that only as the flag stands for liberty and justice is it worthy of respect, end quote. They also chimed in on other venerated national symbols like the 4th of July. And some Adventists portrayed Independence Day not as a song of joy and celebration, but as a lament for America's injustices. Adventists recognized that this all sounded crazy, that this sounded negative and pessimistic. And what did all this even mean? Should Adventists be in a perpetual state of gloom and negativity and cynicism? They were accused all through the press. We see reports that they were being accused of being unpatriotic and un-American. And Alonzo T. Jones was all too eager to address this point. Speaking at the San Francisco Metropolitan Temple in 1896, his title was "What is Patriotism?" And he argued that far from undermining one's commitment to their country, the act of holding the government accountable to its professed ideals was actually an expression of one's patriotism. It demonstrated the love one had for those very ideals. Bible prophecy didn't denigrate government full stop. It drew one's affections away from a narrow fixation on a nation and toward the eternal principles of justice and human rights. The true American patriot, according to Jones, is the citizen who defends the fundamental principles of equality, liberty, and human rights, which are the supposed bedrock of American democracy. So in a sense, Jones is saying that the problem wasn't too much patriotism, but not enough patriotism, this kind of patriotism. From the 1850s through the turn of the 20th century, Adventists repeatedly rehearsed this theme. Now, the subject of Christian nationalism is far too messy for this short talk, but my sense is that the generation of American Adventists that engaged in this debate during the latter half of the 19th century demonstrated how Adventism's distinct apocalypticism could be harnessed to provide a framework for challenging the notions of Christian nationalism. As Nick outlined, times have clearly changed. My sense is that the church will need to revisit its own history to navigate through the complexities of today's cultural, religious, and political challenges. Thank you for your time.